Snow was swallowing the roads. Men were freezing where they stood. German tanks were cutting through the Ardennes like a steel blade, and in the middle of that storm, one small town held the fate of the Western Front in its frozen streets. For 48 brutal hours, everything depended on whether Bastogne would break or hold. If it fell, the German army could split the Allied forces in two. If it survived, Hitler's last gamble in the West would begin to collapse. This is the story of those 48 hours that changed everything. Welcome back to History Plus. If you appreciate clear, powerful war stories told in a way that keeps it real and easy to understand, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, and it keeps stories like this coming. Now let's step into December 1944, when victory in Europe suddenly didn't feel so certain anymore. By late 1944, most Allied soldiers believed the war in Europe was almost finished. After the D-Day landings in June and the breakout from Normandy, German forces had been pushed back across France. Paris was free. Allied armies were moving toward Germany's borders. Newspapers back home were already talking about how the end might come in early 1945. But inside Germany, Adolf Hitler was planning one last massive strike. He knew Germany was running out of fuel, out of trained soldiers, and out of time. So, he chose a bold, risky plan. The idea was simple on paper but incredibly dangerous in reality. German forces would launch a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, a region of hills and thick woods in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Allies believed this area was too rough for a major armored assault, especially in winter. That belief created a weak point in their lines. Hitler wanted to punch through that weak point, drive fast toward the port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies apart. If he could do that, he hoped the Western Allies might consider negotiating peace. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation often leads to bold decisions. On the morning of December 16, 1944, that gamble began. Before dawn, thousands of German artillery guns opened fire. The explosions shook the frozen ground. American units along the front were stunned. Many were inexperienced divisions sent to the Ardennes for what they believed would be a quiet sector. Some units were resting after earlier fighting. Suddenly, they were under one of the heaviest bombardments of the war. German infantry and tanks pushed forward under cover of bad weather. Thick clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow and fog reduced visibility. For the first time in months, the Germans had surprise on their side. Roads filled with retreating American vehicles. Communication lines were cut. Rumors spread quickly that German panzers were everywhere. The front line began to bend backward under pressure. On maps, this bend created a large bulge in the Allied lines, which is how the battle later earned its name. But inside that growing bulge was a small Belgian town that mattered more than almost anyone realized at first. Bastogne was not a huge city. It did not have massive factories or large military bases. What it had was something just as important in winter warfare: roads. 7 major roads crossed at Bastogne. In deep snow and forest terrain, tanks and supply, trucks depended on road networks. Control the roads and you control movement. Lose them, and your advance slows to a crawl. German commanders understood this. If they could capture Bastogne quickly, their armored divisions could keep moving west. With speed was everything. The entire German plan depended on outrunning Allied reinforcements. But the American High Command also realized the importance of that crossroads. Even as chaos spread across the front, orders went out to reinforce Bastogne at all costs. The 101st Airborne Division, known for parachute assaults earlier in the war, was rushed by truck toward Bastogne. Many of these paratroopers had no winter clothing. Some were missing heavy gloves or proper boots. They were told to move immediately. There was no time for perfect preparation. Alongside them came elements of other divisions, engineers, artillery, crews, and tank destroyer units. Their mission was clear: reach Bastogne before the Germans did and hold it. As American forces entered the town, civilians watched nervously from windows and doorways. The people of Bastogne had already experienced years of occupation. Now war was coming back to their streets. Soldiers quickly dug foxholes in frozen ground around the town. Artillery positions were set up. Anti-tank guns were aimed down key. Roads and the air was bitterly cold, breath froze in front of faces. Snow covered rooftops and fields alike. Within days, German forces closed in from multiple directions. What had begun as a defense of a crossroads became something much more serious. Bastogne was surrounded. The ring tightened as German armored units cut off the roads leading out of town. Supply lines were severed. Medical evacuation became nearly impossible. The defenders inside Bastogne were now isolated in the middle of enemy territory. The situation grew worse with the weather. Heavy snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft, which meant no air support and no supply drops. Ammunition began to run low. Artillery shells had to be used carefully. Food rations were limited. Wounded soldiers filled makeshift aid stations set up in churches and cellars. Doctors and medics worked non-stop, often without enough morphine or proper equipment. Frostbite. Cases increased each day. The cold became as deadly as the enemy. German commanders believed the Americans would soon surrender. After all, the town was surrounded. Supplies were low. The weather favored the attackers. So they sent a message under a flag of truce, demanding that the American forces in Bastogne give up to avoid complete destruction. It was a moment designed to break morale. But the response that came back became one of the most famous replies in military history. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, read the surrender demand. His answer was short and direct. Nuts. That single word carried a powerful message. Bastogne would not surrender. The defenders would fight. But courage alone does not solve strategic problems. While the men inside Bastogne held their lines, higher-level commanders had to decide how to respond. The German offensive had created confusion across the entire front. Some Allied leaders initially believed the attack was limited. Others feared it was something much larger. What they all understood was this: if Bastogne fell and the Germans kept moving fast, the consequences could be serious. At this point, another key figure enters the story. General George Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, was positioned farther south. Patton was known for aggressive tactics and rapid movement. When news of the German breakthrough reached him, he did something bold. He proposed turning his entire army north to counterattack the German flank and relieve Bastogne. Turning an army in wartime is not like turning a single unit. It meant redirecting tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and massive amounts of supplies. Roads were icy and crowded. German forces were still active, but Patton had already anticipated the possibility of a German attack in the Ardennes. His staff had quietly prepared contingency plans. When orders came, they were ready. Within a short time, elements of the Third Army began pivoting north. It was a race against time. Every hour mattered. Inside Bastogne, ammunition was being rationed. German attacks tested the defensive lines daily. Small villages around the town changed hands more than once. American units fought from tree line to tree line, often at close range in deep snow. The next 48 hours would determine whether Bastogne remained a symbol of resistance or became a captured crossroads fueling the German advance. On one side were surrounded defenders clinging to frozen ground. On the other side was a moving counterstroke trying to punch through enemy lines in brutal winter conditions. The Western Front hung in the balance, and no one yet knew which way it would tip. Inside Bastogne, the pressure did not ease after the surrender demand was rejected. If anything, it increased. German artillery began pounding the town more heavily, trying to break the defenders' will and destroy key positions. Shells slammed into buildings that had already been damaged. Roofs collapsed. Windows shattered. Civilians hid in basements beside American soldiers. The sound of explosions became constant, almost like a drumbeat that never stopped. The 101st Airborne and attached units formed a defensive ring around the town. They did not control every inch of ground. Instead, they held key roads, wooded ridges, and villages that acted as gateways. Foxholes were dug into frozen soil with tools that sometimes bounced off the ice. Men used whatever they had to strengthen their positions. Logs, doors torn from buildings, even furniture from abandoned homes. Every defensive position had to be ready for tanks. German forces attacked from multiple directions. Their infantry probed the American lines, looking for weak spots. Tanks rolled forward cautiously, supported by machine gun fire. The snow muffled some sounds, making it harder to detect movement at a distance. Often, fighting happened at close range. A German patrol might suddenly appear through the trees, and within seconds, rifles and grenades would decide the outcome. The cold was relentless. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Many American soldiers did not have proper winter boots. Socks froze stiff. Frostbite became common, especially among those who had to stay still for long periods. Medics worked non-stop, but even they struggled with frozen bandages and stiff fingers. Some weapons jammed because of the cold. Oil thickened inside machine guns. Soldiers learned to keep their rifles close to their bodies for warmth. Food was rationed carefully. Ammunition, even more so. Artillery crews were told to fire only when necessary. Every shell had to count. Communication inside the perimeter was fragile. Telephone lines were often cut by shelling. Radio batteries drained, faster in freezing weather. Yet somehow coordination held together. Officers moved from position to position, checking on their men, reinforcing weak spots, and keeping morale alive. Morale is a strange thing in war. It can break quickly, but it can also harden under pressure. In Bastogne, something hardened. The knowledge that they were surrounded could have crushed spirits. Instead, it created a sense of shared purpose. The message was simple. There was no retreat. There was only holding the line. Outside the perimeter, the German command faced its own growing problems. The initial shock of the offensive had worked. The Allied line had bent, but speed was slowing. Fuel shortages were already appearing. Some German units had advanced so quickly that supply trucks struggled to keep up. Roads were clogged with vehicles. American resistance in other sectors forced the Germans to divert resources. The weather that had helped at first was now complicating movement for both sides. German commanders understood that Bastogne needed to fall quickly. As long as it held, their road network was disrupted. Tanks had to detour. Traffic jammed in narrow forest roads. That delay was dangerous. The longer the offensive lasted, the more likely Allied reinforcements would arrive. So they pushed harder. One of the most intense fights occurred in the villages surrounding Bastogne. Places like Neuville and Foy became battlegrounds of house-to-house combat. American soldiers used bazookas and anti-tank guns to stop German armor. Sometimes tanks were hit at close range, flames bursting into the snowy air. Other times, American positions were overrun, forcing small groups to pull back and regroup. The line bent, but it did not break. Back at higher headquarters, Allied leaders were working under enormous pressure. Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower had to assess whether this German attack was a limited strike or something much larger. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery adjusted forces in the north. Across the front, units were repositioned. But the key to stabilizing the center of the Bulge rested on relieving Bastogne. General Patton's Third Army was now fully engaged in its pivot north. The speed of that movement surprised even experienced officers. Entire divisions changed direction in a matter of days. Maps were redrawn, supply routes rerouted. Engineers worked around the clock to keep roads passable. Trucks slid on icy surfaces. Tanks consumed precious fuel. Yet the momentum was real. Patton's Third Corps, led by Major General John Milliken, was assigned the mission of breaking through to Bastogne. Among its units was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. Their task was clear but dangerous. Attack north through German-held territory, punch through enemy lines, and reach the surrounded town. As these units advanced, they encountered stiff resistance. German forces were not passive. They counterattacked aggressively, trying to slow the American push. Snow-covered fields became tank battle zones. Visibility was often limited. Commanders had to make decisions quickly, sometimes with incomplete information. A wrong turn could lead straight into an ambush. Artillery duels echoed through the forests. American gunners fired from concealed positions, while German artillery responded with equal force. The cold made every movement exhausting. Soldiers carried heavy gear through deep snow. Wounded men were evacuated on makeshift sleds or trucks that struggled to move. Despite these hardships, the advance continued. Inside Bastogne, time felt different. Days blended together in cold gray light. Soldiers counted artillery shells and rifle rounds. They checked on wounded friends. They listened for the sound of aircraft overhead, hoping for a break in the weather. Rumors circulated constantly. Some said relief was only hours away. Others feared it might never come. Then on December 23rd, the sky finally changed. The heavy clouds that had covered the Ardennes began to break apart. Blue patches appeared. For the first time in days, sunlight touched the snow. And with that clearing sky came the distant sound of engines. Allied aircraft roared overhead. C-47 transport planes dropped supply bundles by parachute into and around Bastogne. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, and even winter clothing floated down through the cold air. Fighter planes attacked German positions surrounding the town. The psychological impact was enormous. The defenders could see proof that they were not forgotten. The supply drops did not solve every problem, but they bought precious time. Artillery units could fire more freely again. Medics received critical materials. Soldiers who had been shivering in inadequate clothing gained some relief. More importantly, hope strengthened. Meanwhile, Patton's forces were closing in. The fighting grew fiercer as they approached Bastogne's outer defenses. German commanders knew exactly what was happening. If the American armored columns broke through, the encirclement would be shattered. So they committed more troops to block the advance. Every mile became contested ground. In villages south of Bastogne, American and German units clashed repeatedly. Tanks fired at close range. Infantry cleared buildings room by room. Casualties mounted on both sides. Snow that had once been pure white became stained by war. Yet the American push did not stop. Officers pushed their men forward with a clear message. Bastogne must be reached. These were the hours when the outcome truly hung in the balance. If the German blocking forces could hold long enough, Bastogne might still fall from within. If Patton's spearhead moved fast enough, the siege would crack. The next stretch of fighting would decide which side's endurance would outlast the other. The 48-hour counterstroke was now in motion, grinding forward through snow and steel. And as both sides poured everything they had into the fight, the Western Front stood on a knife's edge, waiting to see which force would break first. As the American spearhead pushed closer to Bastogne, the fighting became tighter, more desperate, and more personal. The 4th Armored Division was now only miles away, but those miles felt endless. German forces had dug in along key roads and ridge lines, turning small villages into strong points. Every crossroads had to be cleared. Every tree line could hide an anti-tank gun. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Snow continued to slow movement. Tanks struggled for traction on icy roads. Infantry moved carefully through forests where visibility was limited. German defenders understood that time was their ally. If they could delay the American advance just long enough, Bastogne might collapse from inside. Supplies were still limited. The wounded were piling up. The defenders were exhausted. Inside the town, artillery fire did not stop. German units launched repeated attacks against the perimeter, testing different sectors. Some attacks were repelled, quickly. Others came dangerously close to breaking through. American soldiers rotated positions when they could, but rest was rare. Sleep came in short bursts, often interrupted by shell fire. Despite the pressure, command inside Bastogne remained. Steady, orders were clear. Hold key roads, protect artillery positions, conserve ammunition. Officers kept reminding their men that relief was coming. That belief mattered. In war, confidence in reinforcements can be as powerful as reinforcements themselves. South of the town, the decisive push was forming. American commanders identified Assenois, a small village just a few miles from Bastogne, as a key objective. If they could take Bastogne, they could open a corridor into the town. German resistance there was strong, but the Americans prepared for a concentrated attack. On December 26, 1944, tanks from the 4th Armored Division advanced toward Bastogne under heavy fire. Artillery pounded German positions. Infantry followed, close behind the tanks, clearing resistance from buildings and roadside positions. The fighting was intense but focused. Commanders understood the importance of speed. There was no room for hesitation. By late afternoon, American armor pushed through the village. A narrow path toward Bastogne began to open. It was not a wide, secure highway. It was a fragile corridor exposed to enemy fire, but it was enough. As the lead tank elements rolled north from Bastogne, soldiers inside Bastogne heard something different from the usual shelling. They heard engines that did not sound German. Soon word spread across defensive positions. Friendly armor was approaching. For men who had been surrounded for days, that sound carried enormous meaning. When the first American tanks reached the outskirts of Bastogne and made contact with the defenders, the siege was effectively broken. The town was no longer isolated. Supplies and reinforcements could move in. Wounded soldiers could be evacuated. The psychological shift was immediate. The defenders had held. The counterstroke had worked. It is important to understand that the battle did not end that day. Fighting continued around Bastogne for weeks. German forces still attacked. The bulge in the Allied lines had not fully collapsed. But the moment that corridor opened changed the direction of the campaign. The German offensive had depended on speed and surprise. Now it faced organized resistance and growing Allied momentum. For the men who fought in those 48 critical hours, the experience left deep memories. They had seen how quickly the situation could turn. They had felt the cold cut through layers of clothing. They had watched friends fall in snow-covered fields, and they had also witnessed what coordinated planning and determination could achieve under pressure. The relief of Bastogne was more than just a tactical success. It was a statement. The Western Front would not shatter. The German gamble would not force a split between Allied armies. Instead, the counterattack signaled that the Allies could absorb a surprise blow and respond with speed. As news of the breakthrough spread across Allied headquarters, confidence began to return. The German advance was losing momentum. Fuel shortages were growing worse. Allied air power, now active again under clearer skies, attacked German supply lines and armored columns. The window of opportunity that Hitler had hoped for was closing fast. The 48-hour counterstroke had not ended the Battle of the Bulge, but it had changed its direction. Bastogne stood not as a captured crossroads fueling a German dash to Antwerp, but as a symbol of resistance that slowed and then reversed the tide. And from that moment on, the question was no longer whether the German offensive would succeed, but how long it could survive under increasing pressure. After the corridor to Bastogne was opened, the fighting did not suddenly stop. German artillery still shelled the town. Snipers remained active in nearby woods. The corridor itself was narrow and vulnerable. If German forces counterattacked hard enough, they could close it again. So American units worked quickly to widen and secure the route. Fresh troops and additional tanks began moving into Bastogne. Ammunition stocks increased. Wounded soldiers were finally evacuated in larger numbers. For the first time in days, the foe defenders could breathe a little easier. They were no longer cut off from the rest of the Allied army. On the German side, reality was setting in. The original plan had depended on speed and surprise, but delays around Bastogne had slowed the advance. Fuel shortages became critical. Some German tank crews had to abandon vehicles when they ran out of gasoline. Without fuel, even the most powerful armored division becomes useless. Allied air power now returned in full force. Fighter bombers attacked German columns on roads, destroying trucks and tanks. Bridges were targeted, supply lines were hit repeatedly. The weather that once protected the German advance was now working against it. Momentum shifted. Commanders on both sides understood that Bastogne had become more than just a town. It had turned into a symbol. For American troops, it represented resilience under pressure. For German planners, It was a missed opportunity that disrupted their entire timetable. Every hour spent fighting around Bastogne was an hour lost from the larger objective of reaching Antwerp. By early January 1945, the Bulge and the Allied lines began to shrink. Coordinated attacks from north and south pushed German forces back toward their starting positions. The offensive that had begun with shock and surprise ended in exhaustion and retreat. The cost was heavy. The Battle of the Bulge became one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought by the United States during World War II. Thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units were changed forever by what they experienced in those frozen forests. But the 48-hour counterstroke that broke through to Bastogne marked the psychological turning point. It showed that even after being surprised, the Allies could regroup fast. It proved that coordination between ground forces and air power could reverse momentum quickly. Most importantly, it shattered the illusion that Germany could still dictate the pace of the war in the West. From that moment on, the path led steadily toward Germany itself. Within months, Allied armies would cross the Rhine River. The war in Europe would end in May 1945. Bastogne became part of that larger story, not because it was the biggest battle, but because of what it represented during a moment of doubt. And, sometimes in war, moments of doubt are where history truly turns. When the snow finally began to melt in the Ardennes, it revealed more than broken trees and burned-out tanks. It revealed how close the Western Front had come to real danger. In the first days of the German offensive, confusion and shock had spread quickly. Entire sectors had been pushed back. Supplies were scattered. Communications were strained. For a brief moment, it looked like Germany had found a way to slow the Allied march into its territory. But Bastogne changed that story. The 48-hour counterstroke that broke the siege was not just a military maneuver. It was proof that preparation, leadership, and coordination could overcome surprise. Patton's rapid pivot north was not luck. It was planning. The 101st Airborne's stand was not blind heroism. It was discipline under pressure. The pilots who flew supply missions through freezing skies were not just supporting actors. They were part of a system that adapted quickly when it mattered most. When historians look back at the Battle of the Bulge, they often point to fuel, shortages, weather conditions, and intelligence failures. And all of those factors matter. Germany simply did not have the fuel reserves to sustain a long armored thrust. Once the skies cleared, Allied air superiority returned with overwhelming force. American industrial strength ensured that replacements and supplies kept flowing. But those broader strategic advantages would have meant less if key positions like Bastogne had fallen early. That is why this story remains powerful. Bastogne became a hinge point. If the town had collapsed quickly, German armored units might have kept their momentum. Roads would have opened. The psychological shock on Allied forces could have deepened. Instead, resistance stiffened, the counterattack formed, and within 2 days of concentrated effort, the siege cracked. It is also important to clear up a common misunderstanding. The relief of Bastogne did not instantly end the Battle of the Bulge. Fighting continued for weeks. Soldiers on both sides endured bitter cold and heavy casualties well into January 1945. The battle was complex and spread across a wide area. But the moment that corridor opened changed the direction of the campaign. From that point forward, German forces were reacting more than advancing. For the soldiers who were there, the memories lasted a lifetime. Many spoke later about the sound of shells in the night, about frostbite that never fully healed, about friends who did not make it home. They remembered the fear of being surrounded. They remembered the relief when friendly tanks appeared through the trees. War compresses emotions into sharp, unforgettable moments, and Bastogne was full of them. The civilians of Bastogne also carried those memories. Their town had been occupied, shelled, and turned into a battlefield. Homes were destroyed. Churches were damaged, families hid in cellars as armies clashed above them. Yet after the war, the town rebuilt. Today, memorials and museums stand there as reminders of what happened in December 1944. The German gamble in the Ardennes was the last major offensive in the West. It cost Germany experienced troops, armored vehicles, and precious fuel that could not be replaced. After the failure of that offensive, the initiative remained firmly with the Allies. By March 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. By May, Germany surrendered. The road to that surrender passed through frozen crossroads, like Bastogne. When we talk about turning points, we often imagine one dramatic moment that changes everything instantly. Real history is more complex. Turning points are built from decisions made under pressure, from units holding lines longer than expected, from commanders preparing for possibilities before they happen. The 48-hour counterstroke that reached Bastogne was exactly that kind of turning point. Here on History Plus, the goal is always to make these moments clear and understandable. Without exaggeration, Bastogne was not saved by a single speech or one heroic charge. It was saved by coordination, endurance, and a fast response to danger. That clarity matters, especially when we look back at events that shaped the world we live in today. As you think about this story, consider this question. If you had been a commander facing that sudden German attack, would you have believed it was possible to turn an entire army in winter and strike back so quickly? Or would you have chosen a slower, more cautious response? The answer is not simple, and that is what makes history fascinating. If this deep dive into Bastogne gave you a better understanding of how those 48 hours changed the Western Front, let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the German offensive ever truly had a real chance, or was it doomed from the start because of fuel and air power limits? Share your view below, and if you found this story valuable, share this video with someone who cares about World War II history. It helps History Plus grow and reach more people who want clear, honest storytelling about the past. Your support truly makes a difference. The snow in the Ardennes eventually melted. The guns went silent. But the lesson of Bastogne remains. Even when surrounded, even when cut off, even when the outcome looks uncertain, a determined stand backed by a fast and focused counterstroke can change the direction of a war.